Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be looking at the Chekhover variation, which is a simple approach to attacking the Sicilian defense. Sicilian starts out with e4 and then c5 from black. Typically, play is going to continue with knight to f3, pawn to d6. This is the open Sicilian. Few ways in the open Sicilian you may see pawn d6, knight here to c6, you could also see e6. These are all pretty common, but d6, one of the main lines that you will see in the Sicilian defense. Then after pawn to d4, pawn takes, and now the Chekhover variation, because most people are going to play the main line, and that's knight takes here on d4. But Chekhover variation is queen takes on d4. Now, there's three lines that we are going to look at. The most common by far is what you're going to see is knight to c6. Develops a piece, attacks the queen. So that's going to be pretty common. We're also going to look at pawn to a6 as well as bishop to d7. So let's first look at the main line, and that is knight to c6. And I want to go over the typical moves that you'll see, some of the thought around how you're going to set up your position, and then we'll look at some variations on how the game may play out differently if both sides are not playing the main line. So knight to c6, attacking the queen. The queen does not have to move, but the only way to avoid this is to play bishop to b5, which is the preferred method. Get another piece involved into the action. You don't lose a tempo, because if they just played knight to c6 and you move your queen back, they have gained a tempo or a move in the game. But bishop to b5 gets material involved into the game and says, yeah, you can't take my queen here because this is a pin to the king here on e8. Now, they may stop that pin with bishop to d7, not wanting to lose a tempo. We're just going to go ahead and exchange right here. Keep in mind, you do not have the bishop pair as black does. So something to keep in mind, you have to make sure that you get something back. And really, we need to make sure that we control this game, specifically from the center of the board. Because our opponent has the bishop pair, we don't want to open this game up and allow them to control the game with their bishops. We're going to get more material involved. As we said, knight to c3, knight to f6 here, and now we're going to play bishop to g5. This allows us to castle on the queen side if we want to, and then really launch a strong attack on the king side. You can tell because they have already removed their c-pawn, they're probably not going to castle on the queen side. So this pretty much just leaves the king side open for them. And since we have a better center control, we have more pieces developed, it's a little bit easier for us to just throw everything at the king side of the board and really put a lot of pressure on our opponent. So they really need to play something like pawn to e6 here, stopping us. We don't just, it would be pretty good for white just to take here on f6 if they recapture with their pawn on f6, because then after we castle on the queen side, they no longer have a safe king side as well. So really need to play e6 or e5. We'll look over e5 as well, just so you can see what happens here. But e6 makes a lot of sense. Now if we capture, they can recapture with their queen. Doesn't matter too much. Then if they exchange, if the queens are off the board, so typically not going to see that. But now white's going to castle on the queen side. And then after bishop to e7, then white has rook to e1. And they may castle on the king side here, but you can see white's completed their development. They have center control. Both of the rooks are on the D and E file, one semi-open file, but then also protecting this pawn here on e4. So this is really the main line that you'll see from both sides and kind of the approach that they are thinking about. So let's look at a few variations off of that. We looked at after knight to c3 if they played knight to f6, but they may not play that. They could just try to counter in the center of the board. Maybe pawn to e5. Now they have a backward pawn here on d6, but this is attacking the queen. The queen's just going to fall back to d3. Because white no longer has the light square bishop, doesn't have to worry about blocking off the light square bishop. So just controlling this light square here on d3 still allows for the dark square bishop to get involved into the game. So this is a completely fine setup for white. And many times white's going to be bringing that queen back down here to d3 as well. So pretty common. Even if you look at the position we were just at, as far as how white may continue, at some point, yeah, they may play king to b1 at some point, but also queen to d3 makes a lot of sense, preparing for the knight to come over to d4 at some point as well. So that's kind of the setup that we're looking for. So if we do come back here, if we see that e5 and the queen to d3, this is not a bad thing at all. Bishop to e7. But now we're going to castle on the king side. And the reason for that is usually we're playing that bishop to g5 to attack the knight. Since the knight's not there, we really can't bring our bishop to g5 because they have the bishop and the queen attacking that square right here. And we don't want to bring it to any other squares. f4 just loses to the pawn, and we really want to be pretty aggressive with our dark square bishop. And so because we don't have any other moves right now, we can go ahead and castle on the king side and be okay, because if we castle on the king side, maybe now if they play knight to f6, we can play bishop to g5. But just a slightly different variation because we've decided to castle short side instead of queen side. Still completely fine, just have to be aware of how your opponent is moving their pieces in what order, because that is going to change how we castle and how we develop our pieces. Now let's say they do actually play the knight to f6, but then after we play bishop to g5, instead of e6, let's say now they play pawn to e5. So now that the queen's under attack, we need to bring our queen back here to d3, bishop to e7, but now we're actually going to exchange our bishop. Now they have the bishop pair. We have no bishops on board. That's completely fine, but we need to make sure that we maintain the pressure. We're going to castle on the queen side here. And if they castle on the king side, this is a pretty common variation that you need to understand in the Chekhover variation. So there's lots of things you could see, but this one comes up quite a bit because in this position, white can actually take this pawn here on d6. Now, it would be incorrect for black to go ahead and take here because now white is for sure up a pawn in material. You can just count them. White has 7, black has 6, and there's no real way for black to fight back. If they play optimally, which they may not, but if they play optimally, they're going to play something like queen to b6. Now, white's going to play knight to d5, and then they take here, we take their queen, and after the pawn takes, we take their bishop here on d5. You can see that their rook can come down and take here on a2. So if you look at it and say, okay, white didn't actually gain a pawn in material, but they can get into the endgame with a much better setup, and white should easily win this game. Now, the threat that black has right now is rook to a1, and that would just attack the king, and we would end up with an x-ray losing our rook here on h1. So we bring our rook to a d1, says, yeah, if you play rook to a1, then we can just easily play king to d2. But since we are attacking this pawn here on e5 with both of our knight and our rook, they may decide to go ahead and play rook to a4, attacking our pawn on e4. We take the pawn. Maybe they take our pawn here on e4, and then we play knight to d7, attacking this rook, as well as attacking the pawn on b6 and the bishop on f6. So rook to e8 makes a lot of sense. You always want to have your rooks on the same file. This just allows them to really control the game if they are working together. Now, this is a spot that you want to make sure that you understand the threats that black has, because you may look at it and say, man, there's a free pawn here on b6. Well, it's actually not free. If you take here on b6, then they have the move rook to b4. This is attacking this knight here on b6, as well as the pawn here on b2. And the bishop on f6 is also attacking the pawn on b2. So in this position, you actually want to take this bishop here on f6. Now, is white up in material? No, white's not up in material. Both sides have 5 pawns, and both sides have 2 rooks. But if you look at this, black has 2 double pawns, and white does not have any. So a much better setup going into the endgame. And so this is something where if you're practicing your endgame, this is something you need to be able to turn into a win if you're playing the Chekhover variation. So I used to study this exact position quite a bit, playing against friends and other opponents to see if I could always turn this into a victory. So definitely a good setup, but you need to understand if you come back a few moves and they actually play that castle on the king side and you take here on d6, how you're actually going to respond. Again, it's much easier if they just take here because you take with your rook and there's no real way for them to fight back and get that pawn and material, but they could play queen to b6. You just need to be prepared. So let's come back to the beginning of the variation. After they played knight to c6, attacking our queen, we bring our bishop out here to b5, pinning down the knight to the king. And the first thing we looked at is bishop to d7, but they may not play that. They could play pawn to a6 and just say, hey, yeah, go ahead and take our knight if you want to. I don't want to get my light square bishop involved into the game just quite yet. Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and take that knight. They take with their pawn, and now we're going to castle on the king side. They play pawn to e5 potentially. We come back to d3, knight to f6, rook to d1. And the reason we play rook to d1, because you may say, wow, the knight came to f6. It seems like a perfect opportunity to play bishop to g5. I always like to play lines that allow my opponent to get into a bad position or make a mistake. And that's exactly what rook to d1 does, because they may see this and realize, oh, wow, they have the next move of bishop to g5. So if they play something like pawn to h6 to stop that, seems like a logical move. Not everyone's going to play it, but seems logical, is we can actually just take here on e5 because they can't take here because that would be checkmate. So that is the threat that we have. We can take a free pawn here, e5. And so that would be a huge blunder from them to play h6. So that's why I recommend playing rook to d1 instead of first playing bishop to g5. Now, if they don't play h6, yeah, feel free to go ahead and play bishop g5 if you want to, and then exchange. That's completely fine. Then you can play knight to c3, get other material involved into the game. So that was if they play a6 after knight to c6. They don't have to do that. They don't even have to play knight to c6. So we'll look at the next variation, that is just pawn to a6. Many times in the Sicilian defense, a6 is pretty common. If you're familiar with the Najdorf defense, this is a common move that you will see from black just because it stops so many moves that white's typically going to play. Usually white's looking to play knight to c3 and then potentially come up here to b5, play bishop to b5, attacking this king here because it is exposed since the c pawn is no longer there. So a6 does make some sense. We're now going to play bishop to c4. Still want to get our light square bishop involved into the game, but the difference is in this line we are actually going to have our bishop pair. We may decide to exchange it off, but in the main line, we are for sure always exchanging it off. At least now we're attacking this f7 square, which is a huge weakness for black early on. The king is the only piece that's defending it, so we can change gears a little bit and play more aggressive, attacking the king side than we have before. One example, let's say knight to c6, which is a common next move to now force the queen back. Queen to d3, knight to f6 here, castle on the king side, pawn to b5, extending on the queen side, attacking our bishop. Bishop comes back to b3. Pretty easy here, but now let's say they play e5. We have the move knight to g5. If you watch other videos I have talked about for openings, you know this is a pretty common setup here when you have your bishop on this light square diagonal here, attacking the f7 square. And you can safely bring your knight here to g5. You have a lot of stronger attacks on this f7 square. So this is the threat that white has. It's pretty exciting. They have some interesting ways they can defend this. You know, rook to a7. You know, we can play things like bishop to e3, attacking that. But, you know, again, putting more and more pressure on this f7 square. And even if there's an exchange, it's not that good for black. All of a sudden they have a completely exposed king. It won't be able to castle, and you still have your major pieces that you can attack. So that's what happens if they play a6 early on and how you should continue. The last variation we will look at is, instead of knight to c6, instead of a6, if they play bishop to d7. From here, we're going to play knight to c3, and then after knight to c6 here, we're going to drop our queen back to d3. And the main reason that they might play this is because they want to gain that tempo. They want to push our queen back, and they recognize that, hey, if they play their knight first, then we can just play our bishop out here to b5 and exchange. But if they played in this move order, well, we can't just play bishop to b5 because they could just take our queen and we can't take their queen back, and we're also not pinning down that knight to the king. So this is a legal move. So that's not going to be the play. Instead, we just drop our queen back to d3. Now maybe knight to f6. We can play bishop to g5, attacking the knight, pretty common. Pawn to e6, and you can start to see this is a pretty similar setup to the main line. The only difference is we actually still have our light square bishop. So you are going to be setting it up very similarly. Just know that now the queen on d3 is blocking the light square bishop, so you may not be playing some of the common lines that you typically would. Instead, maybe bishop to e2 to get your rook over to e1. But all in all, it is still pretty similar to the main line, and you won't see bishop to d7 nearly as often as you'll just see knight to c6 early on. So that is the Chekhover variation. Hopefully this was a good overview of how to think about it, how to attack the Sicilian defense. I always am looking for ways to approach a pretty common defense, and the Sicilian defense is one of the more common ways. Growing up, this is actually how I attacked the Sicilian defense because everyone was playing just knight takes here on d4. And when you start to dive in and realize that queen takes on d4 is a very reasonable move, and you have a lot of strong attacking lines, especially when you can castle on the queen side and really throw everything at your opponent's king side, it's a pretty fun opening. So hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Try it out. If you have played it before, let me know what you think. If there's any interesting lines you've run into, always cool to see what people come up with in the Chekhover variation. If there's other openings you would like me to do as well, please let me know in the comments section below, or you can always email me. My information is on my website at thechesswebsite.com. Hopefully you guys have checked that out. There's a lot of cool resources there. But thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next video.